Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. You had 15 seconds left. I don't know if you...
In my next round.
Okay,
Thank you,
sounds
Mr.
good.
Chair.
Next, we have Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Thank you very much to the witnesses for this late evening meeting, but a very important meeting, no doubt. Very, very critical meeting, and thanks so much for your testimony. The first question I have, which is a really simple question, I think, and it'll be directed both to Mr. Imblo and to Mr. Johnson. So my riding of Essex, right next to Windsor, busiest international border crossing in North America. Does it make sense to either of you gentlemen, just briefly, that we would now call it the Toronto-Québec corridor and not go back to the Windsor-Québec corridor when we could potentially tie in the United States into this, the likes of Chicago and whatnot? Are we walking past a golden opportunity if we're doing the events? But anyways.
Well, the mandate is very specific what we inherited, Mr. Lewis. It's really Quebec-Toronto. But we know that there are studies being done as we speak to look at other expansion done by, I think, Transport Canada. So it's out of our mandate, but maybe that question should be put to people of Transport Canada when they appear before this committee.
I would echo that. I've actually spoken with the study team that's been engaged from CPCS by Transport Canada to look at what they're calling HFR Phase 2 in southwestern Ontario. Now, the problem I have with that is that they're calling it Phase 2 because actually solving the problems in southwestern Ontario are much, much easier than solving the problem between Toronto and Ottawa. And we could be solving the problems today. We could be keeping some of the promises that were made 4 or 5 years ago, actually longer, about having multiple trains per day to Sarnia, 5 or 6 trains to Windsor and Essex, and we could be speeding the train from Windsor up by half an hour to Toronto easily. And we could do it today. Via Rail Canada can do it with the government's actual proper backing to implement plans that it's already made.
Johnson. So I'll just build on that quickly then. So earlier on, it was the word grain came up, and moving grain. And ironically, Windsor has a port, and we ship a lot of grain to, ironically, the Chicagos of the world, the Milwaukees of the world, and whatnot. So we talked about grain, which is awesome. Now let's talk about St. Thomas Battery Plant. Let's talk about the Windsor-Stellantis battery plant to the tune of $12 billion investments. Let's talk about critical minerals that hopefully one day will be mined in the far northern of Ontario. And let's talk about not only getting people to the locations, but our critical minerals to these battery plants that are going to, supposed to, fulfill about $5,000 new jobs, roughly. Would it not make sense then to actually do this in reverse to ensure that Windsor is actually the starting point and we move it east? It only makes sense to me with all of the infrastructure that's being put in place in these areas, but by the way, aren't remote. It's actually the hub of North America. Would you agree with me, Mr. Johnson, that this really needs to be looked at very, very closely to ensure we're not walking past an opportunity?
I think it really is a case of the right and the left hand can do 2 different things at the same time here. We can, and this is one of the problems with having separated Via Rail and Via HFR, is that Via Rail is in somewhat lame duck mode and doesn't know what it's supposed to do for the next 10 years to tackle the challenges we have right now. Whereas they could be doing all of the things at once, because some of these things, some of these things, they're all synergistic. They all feed each other. And talking about freight, though, we really need to ask, why did we let the freight railroads abandon so much of their infrastructure and then tell us how they don't have any more capacity left for passenger trains? Because there was a perfectly good double-track line from Essex to St. Thomas 10 years ago, and it's all gone.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. And Mr. Imblo, any final comments, sir? About 30 seconds.
Well, having more passenger train on freight train tracks doesn't make much sense for the reason that you've mentioned. I just don't see in 50 years having passenger train running on diesel between city still slowing down freight train because the economy is growing. In any event, the corridor we're developing, we should have dedicated tracks. No comment on the specific location, but in general, we should get out of the way and have our both dedicated tracks.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And thank you, Mr. Lewis.